So this is Jasmine Mom, a postdoctoral fellow at Arthritis Research Canada, and I'm very excited to introduce Jenny Leese here today. And of course, we'd like to thank all of you for tuning in across Canada. I see we've got listeners from Nova Scotia, Queens and Kingston, of course, St. Mike's Hospital. And before we begin, I'd also like to send a big thank you to Megan Story. She puts a lot of work into helping to organize, along with KT Canada, for hosting us. So just some logistics here. I'll briefly explain the procedure for questions. Jenny will present for about 45 minutes, leaving us with about 15 minutes to open the floor for questions. If anyone at a site or an individual has a question, let us know by contacting the KT moderator via the chat box or just chat to everyone. And just so we're aware that Megan will make sure that everyone is muted upon entry. So without further ado, I'll introduce Jenny Leese. So Jenny Leese is a PhD candidate in Rehabilitation Sciences at the University of British Columbia and a research trainee at Arthritis Research Canada. Her qualitative research in patient-oriented knowledge translation uses an ethics lens to develop e-health interventions with persons living with arthritis. Her work is supported by a CIHR Doctoral Research Award, and her talk title today is Everyday Ethics in Patient-Oriented Knowledge Translation. Take it away, Jenny.
Thank you so much, Jasmine. Hi, everyone. It really is a pleasure to be here today sharing some of my research with you. As Jasmine mentioned, I am currently a PhD candidate at the University of British Columbia, and I'm also a research trainee at Arthritis Research Canada here in Vancouver, where I'm presenting from today. And my research is aiming to better understand ethical issues in the practice of patient-oriented knowledge translation. And I'm using qualitative methods to examine these ethical issues in depth in order to support ethically sound applications of knowledge to improve health. And it's really an honor today for me to speak with an audience who's so experienced in KT, and I would really value any questions or suggestions you might have for me at the end of my slides. So just to recap, my talk today is contributing to an ongoing conversation in the field about what constitutes ethical patient-oriented KT and how it may be achieved. And specifically, I'm going to focus on everyday ethical considerations in patient-oriented knowledge translation, and I'll be spending some time exploring what we mean by that term, everyday ethics. And I'm going to be describing a case example to illustrate some important ethical considerations in patient-partner researcher relationships, which are a key component of doing patient-oriented KT well. And then I'll reflect on practical implications of ethical considerations arising in the case example. So to begin, what do we mean by patient-oriented knowledge translation? Well, we can say that patient-oriented KT forms a key part of patient-oriented research, which is defined here as research done in partnership with patients that answers research questions that matter to patients and that aims to improve healthcare. And indeed, this is a definition crafted in partnership with patients by CIHR's Strategy for Patient-Oriented Research, the BC Support Unit. Patient-oriented KT is therefore about partnering with patients in KT activities that address patient priorities and aims to improve healthcare in ways that matter to patients. And it can refer to partnering with patients in end-of-grant KT activities, so to disseminate findings via, for example, conference presentations or in publications in peer-reviewed journals, or to partnering with patients at any stage of the research process in an integrated KT approach. And the purpose of today's talk is not really to address the value of patient-oriented KT, but rather to highlight some ethical considerations relevant to partnering with patients in KT, whether taking an end-of-grant or an integrated KT approach. So as a framework for thinking through these ethical considerations, we can start by distinguishing first between two different dimensions of research ethics, which we can term procedural ethics and everyday ethics. And procedural ethics is referring to the process of seeking approval from a relevant research ethics board to undertake research involving humans. It's that regulatory process that I'm sure researchers here are familiar with, as they need to go through this process when they've been awarded a Canadian federal research grant as a condition of their funding. And it's a process that's set in place to promote research that's conducted according to the highest ethical standards to protect research participants. And again, I'm sure many of us are familiar with these ethical standards that are outlined in the TCPS2 or Tri-Council framework. And the guidelines in these policies are based on core traditional principles of bioethics. Autonomy, referring to respect for a person's ability to make their own choices, have their own judgments. Beneficence, the principle of doing good to others and avoiding doing them harm. Having concern for their welfare. And justice, the principle of fairness. And the emergence of these procedural ethics is rooted in fundamental wrongs in key moments in the history of doing research involving humans that have driven this need for governance and protections for research participants. So, for instance, the Tuskegee syphilis study is often referenced as an example of one of these key turning points that drove the emergence of procedural ethics. So by contrast, everyday ethics is another dimension of research ethics that focuses on ethical considerations we have as researchers that go beyond the area of a research ethics board scrutiny. And it assumes that as researchers, we have a responsibility to act ethically, regardless of whether there's a formal requirement to do so. And so it's stressing the personal integrity that comes into play in how we go about practicing research, even after a research ethics board has approved our application. So, for instance, an ethical consideration here might be something as simple as us asking a research participant, are you okay to continue in the study? And it's those little things that may seem quite intuitively to be the right thing to do, and so we just sort of do them, and we don't necessarily see them as ethically important or really anything of a big deal. But it's those day-to-day ethical issues that can be quite invisible in the sense that they don't present an ethical dilemma, or they don't appear to be of any great consequence from a traditional standpoint of bioethics. They're the kinds of issues that everyday ethics is concerned with. The issues that they kind of care often, they may affect many people subtly, just on an ordinary, regular day, and they take place in our common interactions with each other. And traditionally, procedural ethics is focused on protecting participants, humans, involved in research as participants or subjects. And although there are exceptions, generally speaking, research ethics board approval is not formally required for engaging with patients as partners in KT. And so everyday ethics is an important dimension of research ethics when research teams are engaging in patient-oriented KT, because they're encountering ethical issues that do not necessarily fall under the scrutiny of a research ethics board. So turning now to look at everyday ethics more specifically in the context of patient-oriented KT, we can draw on tokenism as an example of an everyday ethical consideration. And while tokenism is not typically an area addressed under a research ethics board policy, it is referenced in the literature as an important ethical concern of researchers and patient partners that's relevant to patient-oriented KT. And tokenism is commonly referring to superficial efforts that give just a false appearance of including patients. And as Hahn and colleagues indicate in the paper I have pictured here, tokenism can manifest in a number of different ways in the interactions between patient partners and researchers. And in this paper, patients and clinicians and academic researchers all contributed examples based on their own personal experience and knowledge, examples of tokenism, such as researchers inviting patient partners to participate in activities perhaps as an afterthought, or not really leaving room for discussion and questions in their interactions. So it's also commonly indicated in the literature that building genuine relationships between patient partners and researchers is key to avoiding tokenism. And again, as Han and colleagues outline here, examples of genuine relationship building, they were characterized by the presence of trust, feeling comfortable, valued, and respected, mutual benefits, and having active dialogue with each other. And while more tokenistic forms of relationship building were seen to really involve patient partners feeling that what they say doesn't matter and they were being treated as a means to an end. So we currently don't know very much about patient partners' experiences of tokenism or indeed other everyday ethical issues relevant to patient-oriented KT. In the available evidence, there are anecdotal reports, but empirical evidence, evidence that's developed through systematic research of lived experience is lacking, and is where the qualitative methodologies can lend a hand. So to my knowledge, the case study that I'd like now to present is one of the first qualitative studies to focus on addressing this gap. And it's a study titled, "It Is About Us, Patient Engagement in Health Research." And our research objective here was to use a relational ethics lens to examine everyday ethical issues in patient-partner researcher relationships based on the experiences of patient partners living with arthritis. And the relational ethics lens has been used previously by researchers to bring attention to these kinds of everyday ethical issues in relationships between patients and researchers in health research and also in healthcare. And so it's a lens that supports careful consideration for the quality of our relationships in everyday life situations, enabling us to ask questions such as what's good and bad about the relationship. You know, is that the way I should treat someone else? Is that the way someone else should treat me? And so this study took an integrated KT approach involving researchers and 4 patient partners engaging across different phases of the research process. And as you can see here, from the preparatory phase, one example is that patient partners were initiating the research project by approaching the researchers first with the research idea. And then also in the execution phase, the example that the patient partners were providing their insights to improve our data collection methods. And to the translation phase with patient partners and the researchers acting as co-authors in preparing presentations and journal publications. All 4 patient partners on the project were members of Arthritis Research Canada's Arthritis Patient Advisory Board, and this was founded in 2001, so has over a decade-long history of partnering with the researchers at the research centre. And the board consists of volunteers living with arthritis, some of whom you see pictured here. And their goals are to ensure the patient perspective is represented on research matters at the centre and to communicate research findings to arthritis patients, professional organisations, and also the general public. And so in the study, we conducted a one-to-one semi-structured interview with patient participants who had experience of patient-partner researcher relationships at the research centre. And past or present members of the Arthritis Patient Advisory Board were eligible to take part in the interview, and we used established qualitative methods to conduct in-depth analysis, identifying key themes across these research participants' interview data. And then the thematic categories that came through in our analysis were then considered in light of aspects of the relational ethics lens. So we recruited 22 participants out of an eligible 33. 95% were female. They were aged 26 to 68 years with a median of 60 years. 45% were in paid employment and 41% retired. 59% had at least one university degree. And from a qualitative perspective, This is considered a sufficiently rich sample given the extensive range of experiences that the patient had as a member of the board that was varying from 1 month to 10 years. And so from our analysis, we identified 3 main themes, and one was called being heard, co-building social relations was the second, and the last, adding another spinning plate to an already busy life. And so the first theme, this is a participant talking in an interview. I'll just read it out to you. Chloe's saying, "I'm not ready or know enough yet. I hope to be able to go to the conferences and to talk to the researchers eventually when I feel ready." And Jessica saying, "There's a mutual respect. Patients sometimes need encouragement and reinforcement that their views are not lesser. That's really important because patients are going to be reticent to continue or to contribute if they feel it's tokenism. If they feel it's really valued, then that's going to encourage them to speak and contribute more freely without fear." And participants were commonly perceiving that researchers' contributions in the research process held more weight than their own contributions. They were describing feelings of discomfort, insecurity, feeling fearful when interacting with researchers. And they valued researchers who provided some kinds of reassurances that they deemed patient partners' contributions to be important. And these reassurances strengthened their sense of feeling genuinely respected in their relationships with researchers. Mary here is saying, "There have been some research projects where our feedback has made a difference in how the research was designed. That's showing respect to the patient perspective. The researcher has treated me like a colleague in terms of sitting and talking and asking questions." And many participants also expressed their sense of feeling respected by researchers who actively sought and listened to and took their contributions seriously, acting on them. And Olivia here is saying, "I've seen patients shape some projects. What I saw these investigators had at the end was a much less generalizable project. I don't think that you can discount years of research training for patient experience. We need to figure out the best way to give them both critical weight and maximize each one. The patient is just as important as the researcher, and the researcher is just as important as the patient." And so we saw that if the value of patients' contributions was not well balanced with that of researchers, there was a risk that the quality of the research could be negatively affected. And Olivia here is expressing that questions remain about how to find the optimal balance in valuing the distinct contributions by patient partners and researchers to the research. And finding this balance was viewed to support building a relationship of mutual respect and reciprocity in which the contributions of both the patient partners and the researchers were equally important for achieving quality in research. So moving now to the second theme, co-building social relations. Phoebe Lewis here is saying, "Everybody was on a first-name basis, and right away that power hierarchy is dismissed. So when you're sitting across the table from a researcher and he's just talking about his research as casually as if he was at a Sunday picnic, all of a sudden your comfort level as a patient partner goes up. The researcher would just sit down like the rest of us and eat and talk and sometimes share confidences. And we felt quite comfortable passing them in the hallway and saying hi. We knew a little bit about their families and they knew about ours." And participants were valuing building social relations with the researchers, relations in which there was some kind of informal acknowledgement of each other as people beyond the roles within a particular project. Jessica is here saying, "There's an ongoing relationship that enables more in-depth partnership. True engagement is a continuing two-way dialogue. It's not just project-specific." And again, the participants here were valuing building social relations with the researchers as people beyond their roles within a particular project, on an ongoing basis over time. And this kind of genuine relationship building was also described as a reciprocal exchange or two-way dialogue that flowed with ease between the patients, the patient partners and the researchers. And so moving now to the last theme, adding another spinning plate to an already busy life. A challenging aspect of engaging in KT from the participants' perspectives was the added work that had to be juggled among their existing priorities. And this is one participant talking about some of the negative impacts of this juggling, which she was experiencing. And here she says, there is a constant guilty nagging feeling that I'm not doing enough. I have thought about stepping down from being a patient partner for that reason. Basically, I felt pressure. I have no personal time. My job has been very time consuming. So between all those things, it gives me very little time for my husband. And others were also describing feeling stressed or having guilt from having tasks hanging over their heads, as well as having aggravated symptoms such as pain or fatigue, for example, after attending a conference. But nevertheless, perceiving that the benefits of partnering outweighed the downsides was what helped the participants to continue to partner in KT. And here Mary is saying, you're already dealing with so much yourself, personally in your home life, your own health, your own work life. If you're not able to contribute to some degree because you're in a flare, to the same degree because you're in a flare, there's a level of understanding and appreciation from the researchers that you don't have to feel guilty. Nobody is going to make you feel bad at all when you can't do it. The researchers understand you need to look after yourself, and that's what they want for you personally as well. And so the participants were valuing relationships with researchers in which there was consideration shown for what was going on in their lives beyond the research setting. And they valued this kind of consideration as a demonstration of respect and also of empathy. So they were often describing showing consideration to involve researchers taking a flexible and accommodating approach in their interactions. So Jessica here is describing one example. She says, I was sent a draft of the newsletter by a researcher. Would you have some time to review it before I send? So I think that's really nice. You're not just sent something without a warning and then expected to be able to find a time in their deadline to do it. I replied back that I have a number of commitments. Was the deadline flexible? And right away the response was yes. Again, the communication indicates that there's respect. And so drawing on an aspect of relational ethics that is of particular relevance here in our findings, respect, mutual respect, we can see how the findings highlight how everyday ethical issues of power and vulnerability are experienced by participants when engaging in patient-oriented KT. We're seeing how participants valued researchers who recognized power hierarchies that were perceived and gave encouragement that contributions would be valued as equally important by actively seeking and listening to and acting on contributions. And drawing on another relevant aspect of the relational ethics lens, embodiment, our findings are also highlighting how participants could experience negative impacts of being a patient partner in KT. So for example, having feelings of discomfort, stress, having aggravated symptoms, and not simply as a nice-to-have kind of fuzzy extra, building social relations and giving informal acknowledgements of each other as people with daily lives beyond the roles performed within each project. That was viewed as important by participants because it helped to mitigate the risk of feeling these uncomfortable emotions on these negative impacts that could be provoked by power dynamics that were existing, that were experienced by the patient partners. a relational ethics lens that was of particular relevance was interdependency. And this is an aspect that really calls attention to how an individual is situated within a community, connected with other individuals and institutions that influence their choices. And our findings are highlighting how the participants were building relationships with researchers among their existing priorities in daily lives, how their capacity to choose to partner was juggled among these other priorities. And we saw that participants were valuing researchers who showed consideration for what was being juggled in their lives beyond the research setting. So, for instance, by taking a flexible approach to agreeing deadlines. So our sample included patients with arthritis who had a wide range of experience partnering in KT, varying from 1 month to over 10 years. And this is a key strength of this type of qualitative research because it produces detailed descriptions of everyday ethical issues in a real-world context based on the experiences of patients with arthritis. And findings from small qualitative studies are not really intended to be generalized. These findings are based on the experiences of patients at one center, and they're predominantly female participants, and so we recognize that transferability may be restricted to similar contexts. So our study has since given rise to further research and resource development. Using the interview data from this study, secondary analysis was conducted to develop the patient engagement in research framework, and this is a framework that's identified 8 components that outline meaningful engagement in research from a patient perspective. And secondly, the framework was then used to create a resource, the peer workbook, for research teams to facilitate high-quality partnerships between researchers and patient partners. So it's been addressing other questions really through this work, other questions deserving discussion, not just ethical questions. And this is research and resource development that's been completed by postdoctoral fellow Cleon Hamilton, also in partnership with patient partners from the Arthritis Patient Advisory Board at Arthritis Research Canada. And so in conclusion, drawing on this relational ethics lens, findings illuminate some important everyday ethical issues in building relationships with researchers to optimize patient-oriented KT based on the experiences of patient partners living with arthritis. And better understanding of these ethical issues could support researchers and patient partners to build genuine relationships in everyday practices of patient-oriented KT. And we see these findings as a critical step in supporting an ethically sound practice of patient-oriented KT that prioritizes patient perspectives. So I do want to acknowledge the collaborators and funders who have been involved, and to thank you for the opportunity to present this work, and I hope now we can have a bit of a conversation.
Thank you, Jenny. It's a lovely presentation. You should deliver podcasts or something. You have a beautiful voice to listen to.
Thanks, Jenny.
Jenny, your passion really clearly shines through in working with patient partners. You're clearly very conscientious with your patient partnerships. And I know in my time here at ARC, you've won at least one award for your work in working with patient partners. So we thank you for your presentation and your perspective. So we will now open up the floor for questions. So if you have a question, type it into the chat, and if you send it to everyone, then everyone can see it, or you can send it to the KT moderator host, and then we'll go along and read those. But while we're waiting for people to enter some questions into the chat, I've got a couple of questions for you, Jenny, if I may.
Sure, please.
So you gave us sort of the patient lens in ethics and patient-oriented research, and I'm wondering if there's been any work looking at everyday ethical issues based on the researchers' experiences.
Right, yeah, that's such an important issue as well, isn't it? And I think we saw in the findings of this study, the quote by Olivia with her talking about the risk of researchers' contributions being discounted to the detriment of research quality. I know there were reports in the literature of researchers feeling uncertain or hesitant or certain pressures in going about doing this kind of engagement in patient-oriented KT well. So I think that it's prompting questions for future research that look more in depth about what researchers may be experiencing, what kinds of risks they may be experiencing, when they're partnering with patients. I am aware that there's a CIHR working group who've released a draft of guidance for developing research partnerships with patients, in which they address some of these issues that, some of these everyday ethical issues that researchers may face. So that might be a good resource to check out. And then I'm also involved in setting up discussion groups for research trainees who are involved in this work as well, and I'm doing that with Graham MacDonald, who is another PhD student here at Arthritis Research Canada and at UBC. So we're kind of wanting to create a space for research trainees who are involved in this work, to have a space to share their experiences of these kinds of issues and learn from each other. And so, if anyone is interested in learning more about that, please feel free to reach out, and I'd love to chat with you more.
Great casual plug. Yes, no, you're right. It's important to acknowledge that it's a two-way street here.
Yeah.
Patient partners and researchers. Fantastic. So don't see any questions in the chat. Oh. Yeah, okay, here we go. I do see a chat here, so I'm not sure. So this is from Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario. Mm-hmm. So thank you for the very interesting talk. Do you have any practical strategies that we as researchers can use to engage patients if we don't yet have a patient advisory group?
Right. And they are, based where?
Kingston, Ontario.
Okay. I'm thinking that I'm thinking that a first step may be to reach out to a support unit in the province to see what kinds of resources they may be able to offer. They may indeed have their own patient advisory board or patient council. I do know that the BC support unit one, they do have one here. But I think it may start with having a conversation prompted by a question of sort of how can we be of help, to the patients, to a particular patient group. So it's kind of starting from that place of open communication, which I think speaks to that aspect of mutual respect, which we see in the relational ethics lens. So I hope I answered that usefully.
Thanks, Jenny. We have another question here. This is from Western University. What do patients think about the publication process and being co-authors?
Yeah, again, it's sort of that process of being co-authors. When we're thinking about possible tokenistic practices where patient partners are sort of asked to kind of give the rubber stamp of approval at the very end, or whether patient partners are, engaged at earlier stages and involved in writing content and whatnot. I think when we kind of consider those two approaches to involving patient partners in co-writing a publication, I think it's all of these issues that again come to play around what kinds of contributions would a patient participant, a patient partner value. What kind of level of engagement do they see? Do they want to be involved in? Given everything that they may be dealing with in their daily lives. And so again, I think it's perhaps this starting point of a conversation around how would you feel valued in this process? How are we going to feel respected in this process? And how do you want your contributions recognized in this process? Is it by being a co-author, or is it by being acknowledged in the paper? And appreciating the level of commitment that the patient partner is willing to give based on the context of their daily life.
So I'll just open up the floor one last time here for anyone else who wants to squeeze in another question. We've got some extra time here, but Jenny, that made me think of just a spin-off to that is how else can we recognize patient partner contributions? If it doesn't necessarily have to be through authorship, how else can we recognize their important contributions?
Yeah, well, the case study that I was sharing today, the patient partners were engaging on a volunteer basis, but I do know that there are other ways of recognizing or other ways of engaging that involve financial reimbursements or compensation, and it's a bit of a thorny issue in terms of we as researchers want to demonstrate the mutual respect and give fair credit to contributions. I spoke at length about recognizing the importance of distinct contributions, and of course there are different ways to do it. And again, I think it starts with a conversation with patient partners, that can be specific to the context within which you're working. And there's actually a paper that was written by a patient partner, Dawn Richards, on patient partner compensation and giving guidance from her perspective, from patient partners' perspectives on how to have that conversation. Because it may be, for example, that that the patient partner actually may opt out of accepting a financial compensation, depending on how that may affect other financial, payments that they may be receiving from other sources. So it's quite again, it's about recognizing the complexities of that and having the conversation so that there can be there can be that space for the patient partner to voice their own preferences. Yes, and acknowledging as well that it is quite a sensitive topic that needs to have space to be talked about if there is to be mutual respect in practice.
You're so right. It starts with that conversation. Right? We can't make assumptions. It happens when we assume. So Jenny, I'm going to keep you on the hot seat here.
Okay.
So we have another question from the audience. So they say, thanks for the great talk, Jenny. What role do you see self-reflection playing for researchers who engage with patients in research?
Oh, that's a great question. I think it's a key role, isn't it? This self-reflection piece. I think it's kind of speaking to this issue of being open to others, and seeing, kind of anticipating how your intentions may be perceived by others, and how your behaviors may be affecting others. So I think it is important to pause to anticipate, how you going about your work in this area may be experienced. And I think it's through that kind of self-reflection and questioning that there can be, again, a space to open up to consider others' experiences and others' points of view that then may lead you to, be a more responsive, a more accommodating, a more flexible, a more respectful patient partner. If you kind of have access to others' perspectives on things you may have been doing that you completely took for granted, and it's then again it gives rise to that space for possible improvement. And collaboration and partnership. And I know in the article by Hahn that I was mentioning in the presentation, they talk a lot about how your intentions as a researcher, the importance of matching them up with the methods that you then practice. So I think that might be an area to direct self-reflection, that are my intentions actually realized in practice through the methods that I'm employing, and kind of question from there.
And isn't self-reflection important for all of us in so many different contexts? So I have one last question here from the audience, so if anyone else has a question, please do type now or forever hold your peace. So in your qualitative work, have you examined ethical considerations between researchers and patient partners, where the researchers also the care provider? And sort of a three-part question. We can revisit them if you forget them. Are there additional considerations or any resources that you may recommend?
Well, I know that so maybe to answer the first question first. I think, yes, I think there is an added layer of complexity, isn't there, if the patient partner is, partnering with a researcher who's also a care provider, because it introduces a sort of a possible conflict of interest, where perhaps people are perceiving that the patient partner would be receiving a better standard of care, because of that situation. So I do think that, that there are ethical questions there to be had. And I think we do know from the interviews that I was doing that the patient partners, part of the reason why they were motivated to become a patient partner was that they were wanting access to more information that could improve how they were self-managing their conditions. So that there is that ethical issue there, and I think that the resource that I was mentioning that was put together by the CIHR working group on ethics for patient engagement in research would be a good resource to use there. And there's also the BC Support Unit. They also have released a report called Ensuring the Ethical Conduct of Patient-Oriented Research, where that kind of ethical issue as well is addressed as well, and practical tips on how to go about thinking that through.
Maybe we could arrange to send those resources to Megan and send them out if that would be helpful.
Absolutely, yeah, that sounds great.
Great. Okay. So any other last thoughts that you wanted to share, Jenny, or are we ready to take you off the hot seat?
No, just to reiterate it, really, just thank you so much for the opportunity to speak to you all today, and please do feel free to get in touch if you're also interested in this area. I'd love to hear from you.
Great. Well, thank you everyone for attending, and thank you again, Jenny, for your lovely presentation and your valuable insights. It's been a real pleasure, and so glad we had to have a bit of a conversation around it too. Also, again, thank you to Megan Story for all the work she does, and with KT Canada, you guys make sure that these presentations run like well-oiled machines. As a reminder to everyone, make sure you email Megan Story with your evaluation forms or complete the online evaluation. And our next session, mark it down in your calendars for May 9th. That'll be with Carol Estabrooks from Alberta, and she will be presenting her work on the TREC initiative. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Jenny. Thank you, Jasmine. And thank you, everyone, for attending.
Thanks, Megan.
Thank you.